Hello everyone, I am Megha Mazumdar. I welcome you all to the Stories of the Indian Diaspora series with reference to TMYS Review's June 2021 project that invites stories on the Indian diaspora. This is to investigate the ambition-based movement under our annual theme of migration, resettlement, and displacement. We are honored to present our delegate today, Professor Dr. Anustup Basu. Dr. Anustup is an associate professor in English, Media, and Cinema Studies and Criticism at the University of Illinois at Urbana, Champaign. He is the author of Hindutva as Political Monotheism, published by Duke University Press in 2020, Bollywood in the Age of New Media, the Geotelevisual Aesthetic, published by Edinburgh University Press in 2010, the co-editor of the volumes Intermedia in South Asia, The Fourth Screen, published by Routledge in 2012, and Figurations in Indian Film, published by Palgrave Macmillan in 2013. As a film producer, he made the Bengali feature Hubbard in 2005, which won the Indian National Award for the Best Regional Film. We welcome you, Professor. We
Hello.
also have with us today Professor Dr. Saurav Banerjee. Dr. Saurav is an associate professor at Mahitosh Nandi Mahavidyalaya in Hooghly, West Bengal, a government-aided college affiliated to the University of Calcutta. With 17 years in teaching, his areas of interest are Shakespearean drama, gender and culture studies, romantic poetry, post-colonial literature, and post-humanism. He has conducted one-to-one online interviews with academic stalwarts like Francisca Ferrando, Bill Ashcroft, Paul Sherrod, Evangelina Vasilako, and Shamanto Das. He is also presently an Education Ambassador India of International Organization of Educators and Researchers in Philippines. We welcome you, Professor. Now I'll request Professor Saurav to proceed with his interaction with Professor Anustup. Thank you.
Thank you, Megha. Thank you for your kind words. And a warm welcome to Anustup and also our viewers. So I'll begin with my first question, and I'll begin with very basic things. We know that any journey may have multiple motives. The two most important ones being one is simply wanting to leave the place where we are living at the present moment to go anywhere else. In this case, the destination doesn't matter. And the second being the desire to go to a fixed destination. So in this context, we'll be eager to know the story of your journey from India to the States. Would you kindly share with us why, when, and how you shifted and your choice of the United States of America?
Right. Thank you for inviting me here. So if if in terms of beginnings, that would be the fall semester of 1998, August 1998, when I first came to the United States. Now, before that, obviously, I had to apply to go, the GRE, the TOEFL, and those things happened over months. But what prompted me? I had taken a break of about a year and a half, after my master's, and during which I was doing advertising, some freelance journalism, and also television screenwriting. So I was, from a certain point of view, I was doing quite well, and but there was, there was that need for a change, and I was always drawn towards a life of the mind. And then, obviously, someone told me, and it was a pretty practical conversation, that if one has to sort of apply, one has to apply now. I was about 26, 27 that time. And so in between my, my work as an advertiser, I'm sorry, I don't know what's happening. in between my work as an advertiser and my freelance television, this, that work, I put together my applications and applied. And I actually applied to only one school, the University of Pittsburgh, because a very dear friend, a senior friend, but a mentor and a friend, Madhava Prasad, is, one of the best scholars of Indian cinema. He had gone to the University of Pittsburgh, and I thought, well, why not? And just applied there. And then I almost forgot about it. And those were like pre-internet days. And then suddenly, so there was this, telephone sort of business where there was a fax machine. It was like 45 minutes away from my house. And then they called me that, a fax had arrived at their place, which was the admissions offer. And then I went, and then I started thinking about it, and then, just decided to go. So it was primarily a matter of exploration, getting out and into the world, and in pursuit of something which I actually didn't know at that point. Just to give you an example, I wanted to work on, I think, social Darwinism in 19th century Bengal. I ended up writing a dissertation on Bollywood. So, that's the journey that we are talking about.
Okay. Thank you for the insight into your choices and why the states. So I think Megha, you can carry it forward.
Sure. Once again, a very warm welcome, Professor. So my question deals with one of your works. So in your book, Bollywood in the Age of New Media, the Geo-Televisual Aesthetic, how do you point at something like Bollywood, which is highly specific, under the canopy of modernization, or geo-television, which is quite holistic or global, rather?
Well, so, if we are talking about Bollywood, I'm going to try to break up my answer into about three parts. First, Bollywood is a very recent phenomenon. You as a kind of a media assemblage, as an industry that covers not just films but a spectrum of media activities, from cell phone ringtones to advertising and a whole lot of other things. That's relatively recent. It's about a quarter century old at the most, and there has been work done on this by Madha Prasad, Ashish Rajataksha, and Ashwin Punathambekar, and others apart from me. So, but if you talk about the film industry in what used to be Bombay, and then it became Mumbai, it was actually quite cosmopolitan from its beginnings. So if you think about the 20s, 30s, and even 40s and the 50s. So popular Indian cinema, well, after the talkies, popular Hindi cinema, was an assemblage of these worldly impulses. So you had films based on Tarzan, films based on Zorro, films, spectacular kind of what you would call ruritarian romances, sword fighting films, and then later the Italian peplum, if you think about the films starring Dara Singh, for instance, or westerns, right? One of Guru Dutt's films, not seen a lot, is Baz, which is a pirate adventure, right? Something you don't associate with Guru Dutt. Film like Naushirane Dil, Shorab Modi's, could be set in Persia in the mid 50s. Bimal Roy's Yahudi was set in ancient Rome. So it was quite worldly, sort of absorbing these pictures and sounds at the level of music, at the level of spectacle, at the level of costume. It was impelled by several impulses, the Arabian Nights fantasy to the American Western to the Prisoner of Zenda kind of thing, and a whole lot of others. Um, I would argue that it was in the 60s and the 70s and the 80s, just before the onset of globalization, that this cinema took a kind of an inward turn. I mean, and part of it was economic, because of a whole lot of problems pertaining to um, sort of raw stock quotas, exporting films, bringing back films, uh, having access to foreign markets. This was a period, that is the 60s, 70s, and 80s, that Hindi cinema actually became a bit insular. And anything foreign, and this was also during the time of the Chinese war, and then the war with Pakistan, the two wars with Pakistan. So anything foreign was related to sort of Cold War intrigue. The villains from Shakal to Mogambo, all, and they were the personalities with high tech, high tech gadgets, like these larger than life dens of villains that we saw. They had submarines, they had these weaponry and gadgetry that was alien to a kind of an Indian experience. So that became a kind of polarization, in the 60s, 70s, and 80s, where a certain cultural imagination decided to become protectionist. But when we come to Bollywood, which is what my book is about, so Bollywood happens at a moment when, and we actually saw that when we were in our mid-20s, that, when we went within a space of like 2 or 3 years from about, a few Doordarshan channels to this hyper expanded media space, with featuring like literally dozens and then hundreds of different television channels, showing these different things in the world. And so I think Bombay cinema from the 90s had to absorb these new sights and sounds, and find a cultural expression of that absorption itself, right? So you had these for instance, if you think about the marriage melodramas, the Hum Aapke Hain Kauns, and then Kabhi Khushi Kabhi Gham, and all these films that featured these hyper rich upper caste families, and what you had in those houses, Ranjani Majumdar calls them panoramic interiors, right? In those houses, you have this strange staging of tradition, high Hindu tradition, these rituals, these pujas, and things like that. And at the same time, they are sort of literally glutted with consumer goods, right? New lifestyles, signatures, new kinds of gizmos, gadgets, things, cars, helicopters, etc. And so that is the idiom, by which um, Bollywood tried to square a kind of a, essential Savarna vision of Indianness with the plenitude of the world. And so, you had these strange, I call these cinematic formations, assemblages, and you had these very strange kind of instances. Well, I mean, for instance, if you think about a film like Hakikat, it's a mid 90s film starring Ajay Devgan, I think, and Tabu. So the main characters, the hero and the heroine, as they say, are slum dwellers. He's a garage mechanic and she's a music teacher. And both of them live in slums, but their song sequences, the dream sequences, take place in Alpine Switzerland, with both of them wearing Armani suits. Right, and there's another David Dhawan film where I think the lead was Rishi Kapoor. He is drunk at one point and he starts driving a car, right? And behind the car, in the back seat, I think, is a mannequin. And he starts driving the car in Bombay City. And by the time the car comes to a stop, it's in Switzerland. And the mannequin comes alive as Madhuri Dixit with a blonde wig, and the song sequence takes place. So, and in many cases, actually, the city that you see, the city of Mumbai that you see in these films, is kind of an transnational assemblage itself. That is, it's part actual Mumbai, it's part Mauritius, it's part something else. And this is an idiom that a cinematic culture developed, which was almost a schizophrenic negotiation with the self and the invasion of the world, of these worldly things, new vistas, new desires, new aspirations. So that is, I to go back to your question, I would not agree with the fact that Bollywood is localized. It maybe was for a few decades, but if you take a long history, there was always a kind of a worldly aspiration, worldly negotiation, which became pronounced in the 90s also for very practical reasons, because the overseas markets opened up, and top tier sort of Bollywood films were made as much for the diasporic audience and the Indian metropolitan audience. Actually, they were made more for that audience, that diasporic as well as elite metropolitan audience, rather than the janta, the common people, as it were, and increasingly so.
Yeah.
Absolutely. That's actually extremely opens a lot of perspectives in my head right now. So my next question also deals in the same book of yours, and now that we have talked about the transnational aspect of Bollywood. So in this very book again, there's a point where you mention about the continuous return of the mythic oral narrative, the continuous retelling of the same mythic instances in times that are changing. So alongside the fact that it is done with a notion of instilling the cultural emblem of the country in the viewers, can this be looked at as a sign of to solidify a hope, more like a second coming in the literary sense, where all the good will dissolve all the bad one day, like we saw how it became a trend during the first half of the pandemic last year? For every individual of this country to watch or rewatch, for people who have watched it before, the epic serials of the Ramayana or the Mahabharata, and how the senior half of the population was actually in a trance, and they started looking at this initiative of the government as a sign of instilling hope and strength among the citizens. So, can this also be a reason for the mythic incorporation in the Bollywood cinema?
Right. Yes. I mean, if you think about the mythic, and especially the mythic in what can be roughly called the Indian imagination, like two statements. Two statements come to mind. One is by I'm almost sure it's Fanishanath Renu, the Oriya, great Oriya writer, who said all stories are stories of the Ramayana. Or another statement made by A.K. Ramanujan, which sort of stated that which talked about a certain imagination that views the given world itself as the leftovers of Vyasa. The world itself is what Vyasa just left out, or he could have easily incorporated. Now, there's a part in my book where I talk about this, essential cultural tendency, habit of retelling. Not necessarily, directly retelling stories, but restaging them in different contexts, in different temporal orders. So that is definitely a matter of, you could say, hope, affirmation, affirmation of a certain essence, let's say, or affirmation of a certain temporal order of justice, and the constitution of the self. In other words, no matter how things change around us, that is, globalization comes in, the cities change very fast, the villages change very, very fast, new technologies appear, and life constantly threatens to be off kilter. So what these epic narrations, re-narrations do is affirm a belief that no matter how things change externally in terms of a phenomenology of the actual world, it is still somewhere the same conflict between good and evil that you see in the Ramayana. You just have to identify who exactly are the Ravanas of today and who exactly are the Rams of today, and so on and so forth. And so that I deal with that in the book, talking about these several remakes of Mother India, as one of the texts of Indian cinema. It's very strange that this is a film that gets remade with visible changes almost almost punctually every decade, every changing moment, every turn in history. So yes.
Thank you,
So
Professor.
Megha, I take it over.
Yeah, please.
Yeah, so I'll continue with films, Bollywood films, but I'll move away from your work. So this iconic movie, Sholay, since we're talking about Bollywood, we cannot but mention Sholay, has its villain Gabbar Singh saying, "Jo dar gaya, samjho mar gaya." One who gets frightened dies.
Right.
So in the context of this movie, we see that he has established his rule over the villagers of Ramgarh and the adjoining areas through this imposition of fear. But at the first sign of resistance, he himself feels frightened, he's threatened. And thus the question, kitne aadmi the? As in, how many people were there who revolted? Now, talking of the present American context, do you feel, as a person of Indian origin, that the violence against the blacks, the Asians, and the Mexicans is an expression of a country that is frightened with the presence and or the rise of these ethnic others, although America is supposed to be a melting pot of many cultures?
It's a very, very interesting question. So yeah, let me begin with the Sholay metaphor, right? So
Yeah.
Sholay is often called curry western, which kind of brings it into kind of a state of affiliation with the Wild West in the American imagination.
Hmm.
So, what is the context of Sholay and what explains Gabbar Singh? And it's there in the film. Ramgarh is a village without a police station, without a post office, without a without a fire engine, right? In other words, it is a place where the state hasn't arrived. So there is a kind of an antiquated feudal order represented by Thakur Sahib, but Gabbar looms large because the state, the apparatus of the state, hasn't arrived. Right? Ramgarh is a place without electricity and etc. Now,
But let me
this
interrupt. Let me
right,
interrupt. But it still has an overhead tank
it has an overhead tank. Yes,
from where this Dharmendra tries to jump off and suicide. So and
right,
commit suicide. So like
right. It
that is a
has an
failed set. They
overhead.
had plans. Yeah, they had plans of instilling electricity, but the government has failed. You are absolutely correct. The state
Right.
has not yet arrived.
Okay. No. So now let me, you know, uh, retransfer this metaphor,
Sure.
uh, to the Wild West. So the American West. So when you think of the current conflicts, right, they have a pretty long history, right? Uh, and that is a history we don't necessarily see in the dominant mode of the American Western film. That is, the Chinese workers who worked in the railroads, the
Hmm.
transcontinental railroads. We see black people of only a certain kind. We see women of only a certain kind. We see Mexicans of only a certain kind, right? So that history of conflict is uh, is a long one, and it gets periodically, given that the United States is a nation of immigration and genocide, the genocide of Native Americans. That history gets reenacted periodically, and actually, it is. It gets reenacted periodically in a spectacular sense. Things we notice in media, we notice in news broadcasts, and etc. uh, you know Events that are big enough to, let's say, travel across the seas to India and appear in Indian newspapers. But if you look at it in diurnal terms, day-to-day terms, it is consistent, right? And slavery, for instance, is what people call the original sin of America. And that is the legacy of that sort of plays out every hour, every minute in American inner cities, and in the Midwest, and uh, all places. Um, and so uh, I think if you talk about the current moment, kind of, which is a combination, which has Black Lives Matter at one end, and kind of a Trumpian know nothing nativism. Know nothing movement is obviously from the mid 19th century. So that might seem like a new development. It is not. It's just a kind of a new alignment, and that is because of certain transformations after globalization in the long run, the 2008 market crash. The American white middle class male is feeling very insecure economically and culturally, and feels threatened that that their apex position in the cultural, political, and economic
Hmm.
spectrum has been challenged. So that is uh, what we are witnessing now is a especially aggravated moment. But that aside, if you think about the kind of violence this society has been absorbing year after year, we are talking about, let's say, 1.5 million people dying of gun violence in the last couple of
Hmm.
decades. If given that uh, about 37,000 or more, 38,000 people die in the United States due to gun violence every year. I mean, if you look at it, if this was any other country, the Nations would have declared that,
Hmm.
just by looking at the numbers, that there is a civil war going on in that country. If there is no civil war, like 35,000 people can't die of gunshots, right? So, uh, but then that is the, you know, usual diurnal violence that this society, with its peculiar historical and social configurations, has had to absorb for a long
Hmm.
time.
Okay. Okay. Thank you. I was wondering if I had overstretched the metaphor a bit, but now I think I know. Okay, uh, my next question is actually very deeply connected with the scope of our project. For this particular project of ours, we are looking at ambition-based migration, and the delegates we have been conversing with are all people who are well established, and more importantly, people who can afford the luxury of traveling between their countries of origin and place of resettlement, and even a few more countries. Cosmopolitan is perhaps the best term that can be used for them.
Okay.
Though this is a minuscule percentage, but the number of such people is rising. Do you think that these cosmopolitan people have a worldview that is entirely different from the other immigrants who are ruled by the borders and bordering practices of the state? And how does the state view these cosmopolitan people?
Well, I think one obviously needs, and if you think about a certain history of thinking about cosmopolitanism, that we can trace back to Immanuel Kant, right? So more than 2 centuries ago. um, I think it needs to be rethought in our time, in this particular moment of globalization. What exactly do we mean by cosmopolitan? Is it having the ability to move from one country to the other, or making the world itself your playground? Or we need to think about the cosmopolitan question beyond uh, national borders. In other words, what I'm saying is, I view cosmopolitanism, or the cosmopolitanism question, as primarily in our world as a country as a sort of city and country divide, not a nation, you know, to nation
Okay.
divide. If you think about South Bombay, what are you thinking of? You're thinking of a city with one of the largest billionaire and millionaire counts in the world. You're talking about a space, an urban space, with some of the, you know, highest real estate prices anywhere in the world. And you get inside a car, travel, I don't know, 75 miles in any direction. Well, except that in a certain direction you might fall into the Arabian Sea, but you you uh, travel 75 miles in any direction. What do you reach? I mean, what space is that? That's the India of one of the largest hungry populations in the world. India with one of the largest HIV positive populations in the world. It's a different world, right? And it's the same uh, kind of striated reality that that plays out here in the United States. I mean, there is no comparison between, San Francisco and the incredible poverty I saw in Mississippi when I was driving through a few years ago. So what I'm saying is cosmopolitan movement is moving from Bombay to Delhi or Delhi to Bombay or Bombay to Hyderabad, and there is an entire other world which here we call flyover country, right? That is there. So I really I thought of that. I don't know whether it sort of answers your question, but when we, from the economic point of view, increasingly when we talk about a global financial elite, I think R.F. Dillek has called them the astronaut class. Astronaut class means they actually do not necessarily have a home, which you can properly define in geopolitical terms, but they are the investor class. They live in airports. They can fly to anywhere in the world. They can have a summer house in Paris and a winter palace in Manila or whatever. Now this sort of there are a lot of conspiracy theories, discourses of envy, discourses of otherness, etc., about this transnational elite. And let's say we are, in some ways, in maybe very small ways, part of that traffic. But there's a very kind of a strange duality there, right? In the sense, increasingly we have these nativisms across the world, nativist movements, who kind of a son of the soil movements. But everyone, at the end of the day, looks to this investor class to invest, right? Invest in, and there is this is a kind of a duality that I find very intriguing. That is, you have these authoritarian figures across the world trying to build a very nativist, aggressive kind of illiberal social formation. Be it Turkey, be it Brazil, and elsewhere. We know which places we are talking about. But at the same time, they want people to come and invest for development and things like that. I don't know whether it answers your question, but this is what I could think of.
No, it does. It does, because I mean, even if you have not said it in so many words, it does prove that there is a group of such people, and the states view them differently. Definitely, they woo them. They woo them for investments and other things. So a lot of relaxation is also made for them.
Yes, and okay. I think that point is important. And it became apparent when there was the mass migration of immigrant workers from the cities of India. To me, that was crossing a boundary. That was crossing a border, right? It was a border between the global global metropolitan order, and the global hinterland at large. Right? You are either in the city or outside it.
Yeah, absolutely.
Right.
Okay, Megha, take it over.
Yeah, now that the conversation has got so interesting, you're talking about conspiracy theories, and now at the last moment you talked about nativism. So my next question deals with something that depends on language or communication. So in the Abstract Your Essay, The Human and His Spectacular Autumn, or Informatics After Philosophy, you mention how temporal dictatorship replaces the historical importance of communication or administration under the garb of informatics. So, how questionable, or if I may put it that way, precarious, is the condition of the philosophical study of communication? And then, even if we trace it back to Saussure semiotics to be philosophical.
Right. So, you know, I'm going to cut a long story short here. I am interested in a new order of politics in our times and in our world that is based on information, right? And information, as Walter Benjamin once put it, is something that is already shot through with explanation. Information is something that is already shot through with explanation, right? So, in other words, if you have a polity in India, in the United States, in various places across the world, where political consensus can be increasingly manufactured, political perception can be increasingly governed by informational command. That is, you know, how fast and how widely you can disseminate your WhatsApp messages, and how how thickly, how frequently, right? So that in that scenario, politics is no longer, just a matter in a classic sense. If you think about politics in the Aristotelian sense as a matter of virtue and public action, uh, it no longer remains that. It remains. It increasingly becomes a matter of perception control through information, right? And there, the the question of speed becomes crucial. In other words, my information is always, no matter what the content is, my information is going to be always better information than your information if my information is faster than your information. So this is something that I'm interested in, and I think a lot of people across the world are interested in that. Increasingly, demagogues across the world are just completely, they're lying in front of the camera, knowing full well that they will be fact checked. But for them, it's the intensity, the thickness, the frequency of the message that matters, not whether it's true or false, right? So this relationship between information and what we call post-truth environments is something I'm interested in. And that essay was written about, I think, 20 years ago, was the first foray in that direction.
Okay, that's quite interesting actually. So I'll move to religion now. So in your book, Hindutva as Political Monotheism, uh, it quite revolves around Carl Schmitt's way of looking at the politics of theology. And as we know in his book, The Concept of Political, he has very questionably mentioned how, I quote him, the specific political distinction, ellipsis, is that between friend and enemy, unquote.
Right.
And he further goes on to state that this distinction is essentially public and not private. So, but you, on the other hand, have brought in concepts like monotheism or Hinduism's quote unquote claim to Hindutva, which is absolutely political as well as historical, and the inevitable aftermath of such a claim, genocide being a prominent one. So, how did you then align all these public affairs of distinction with what Schmidt examines as the private?
Uh, okay. So my take of point, my take of point vis-a-vis Schmidt is his declaration that all modern political concepts are secularized religious ones, right? So basically let's start with that easy premise that all modern political concepts are secular transpositions of what were originally religious motivations, right? So that's how he understands the history of modernity, or liberal secular modernity, right? uh, Now, but my point is that uh, you know given the tradition that he comes from, the European, very unapologetically European tradition that Schmidt comes from, and actually with a very strong Catholic bend. Uh, in Schmidt, religion automatically means an Abrahamic religion. That is, uh, the category religion assumes that if you're talking about a religion, it has to be uh, along the Semitic model. So that is one. Two, what Schmidt says is that, in other words, you know, a nation can be imagined in various ways, right? In terms of common language, common history, common histories of migration, etc., settlement, and so many other ways. But if a nation has to be imagined along religious lines, that religion in itself, by default, has to be a monotheistic religion with creedal precision. In other words, that's how Schmidt would, for Schmidt, England is always Anglican England. Spain is Catholic Spain, right? And that explains Trafalgar, right? So, in other words, what he says is interesting, that you, behind all political urges, there's a religiosity. It might be without the religion itself, but a religiosity that is jealous. That is, that makes a fundamental distinction between the believer and the non-believer. That is, the jealous Abrahamic God. If you think about Exodus 25, I am a jealous God, right? And who cannot tolerate false idols, right? So it is on that principle, exacting distinction between friend and enemy, that um, Schmidt sort of founds his idea of the political. And the big change, as you point out here, is unlike, let's say, again, if we go back to Kant and his Enlightenment essay, public exercise of reason and private exercise of reason and all of that. So there's a classical tradition, public private, in that regard. For Schmidt, the enemy, by categorically speaking, the enemy has to be public, right? Even though that enemy can be a personal friend, right? So within a polity, a certain segment, let's say Jewish people, might eminently be enemies, public enemies there, but I might have Jewish friends. That's a completely different matter altogether. Now, my book is about, given the tradition of right-wing thinking in Europe and its actually historical affiliations in the Indian context, how this model of jealous nationalism was, came in the Indian context, and it sort of demanded a primary condition. That is, we know that Hinduism is an assemblage of pieties. It is widespread. It's pluralistic. It's eclectic. But there has to be, in order to be a Hindu nation, there has to be a principle of jealousy that has to be invented, that can separate the Hindu political actor from the other. And that's what I have investigated in the book.
That actually reminds me very profusely of how what Milton does with Paradise Regained or Samson Agonistes, where he actually deliberately claims for a distinction between your God, my God, how I'm disobeying my God, I'm being punished by your God. So this is very complicated, like how it exists everywhere and how you talk about Anglican England. So it makes so much sense. So okay, I'll not take more time. I'll give it over to you, Professor Saurabh.
Mhm.
Yeah, actually we are short of time, so but still, I think I have a couple of questions and Megha has a question, so we'll run through them quickly. So, what I want to ask you next is, even in this age of transnations and transnationals, there still are barriers of race, class, and culture. So, in this context, I'd like to ask you, how difficult or how easy was it for you in particular and for the Indian immigrants to the United States when you shifted to migrate? And the next part of the question is, have things changed now? And if yes, is it for the better or for the worse? And how have the failures and success of the Antifa and the Black Lives Matter movements, respectively, affected present immigration policies?
Right. So, for me personally, uh, I went there. I went to the I came to the United States rather,
Hmm.
when the world was different. It was a pre 9/11
Uh,
world, right? And I still remember 9/11. I was in Pittsburgh, and when the first two planes struck, I was taking a class in the Cathedral of Learning, and which is at I think 42 stories high, and it's the second highest academic building in the world. And I was taking a class there, and then there was there was a rumor that there was a plane coming towards Pittsburgh, and the best building to hit was that building itself. Anyways, so that was there, and I remember after 9/11, one day suddenly, like about 30 or 40 of our graduate student friends just turned up at our house with beer and wine, and they sat in the backyard, just talking and not exactly partying,
hmm,
but and I realized later that was to and we used to live in a sort of old Italian neighborhood. It was to sort of assure our neighbors that we were okay,
okay.
right? So that was there. Then we came to the Midwest, that is the University of Illinois in 2005, and we've been here since. But in all these questions, again, there is a very big class factor, which you know, I think in the world is full of conflict, and what individuals can achieve to great or to small or great extent is a kind of buffering. That is how you protect yourself from certain you know uh, existential conflicts. And for me, the protection has been that I've always been in, well, I've either been in Pittsburgh, which is an old city, but it's a city, or I have been in a university town, which is a kind of a bubble,
Hmm.
right? Uh, a Big Ten university town, about 10,000 professors, 40,000 students.
Hmm.
And that is a kind of an insulation from a larger conflict that takes place in the streets of America every day, every hour, right? And that is a calculation that um, immigrants of my class always make. Like when I came here, or when I was applying, I was told stay close to the coast, either the East Coast or the West Coast, right? When I was a graduate student, we were driving from Pittsburgh to Philadelphia, about 5 hours. A professor came and told us, gas up and drive, do not stop on the way. right? So I mean that's hyperbole, but the point is that that there's a kind of a geography of
Hmm.
whatever you're talking about, of geography of immigrant experience, and it's not the same, and it differs according to class, where you are. I mean, if you are in New York City, it's radically different experience than if you were, let's say, in Stillwater, Oklahoma.
Yeah.
And that spectrum is impossible to cover in a, in an answer. I can't answer for that. It's too big.
Okay, I get it. I get the picture. Yeah. Yeah, Megha, please take over.
Yeah. So now that we're already talking about class, so my last question for you is like in your co-edited anthology, Intermedia in South Asia, the fourth screen, um, essays covering quite a lot of televisional disciplines have been compiled. But while reading the abstract to this anthology, I noticed the word quote unquote tinkering of the subaltern in the new media. So, what is so casual, like if I take it etymologically, what is so casual or unplanned about such an emergence, even when we can trace certain groundbreaking revolutions as a result of the appearance of the subaltern in the media?
Right. So, well, I did not write that, but from what I understand, given the spirit of the collection, that a lot of people in that collection who wrote for that collection were interested in a kind of a ground up view of globalization and a technological transformation of societies, right? And the ground up view, in other words, came from certain things we used to see. I mean, we still see that, if you go to a kind of a chor bazaar here or there, you meet people who are barely literate but can take
Hmm.
apart an iPhone and put them back together and do various other things with it. Um, in other words, it's a kind of a ground up appropriation of the instruments of global telephony or communications revolutions, whatever you might call it. And uh, so, in a sense, jugaad, as I mean, that would be a kind of a jugaad, as you would call it.
Yes.
And but then that apart, we also have people always trying to. Uh, and sometimes romantically so, understand this global order being subverted by a spectrum of subaltern energies. I mean, the guy who
Hmm.
takes apart the iPhone in some chor bazaar is one, but the hacker, sitting somewhere in some basement in Norway, uh, uh, trying to threaten the financial elite is also another. I think that was roughly what uh, they meant by uh, a subaltern tinkering. But I think I'll stop at that. I mean, that to what extent that has been followed up in the volume is for you to judge.
Okay, so I'll move on to the last question of the day, and we'll move on from all the theories and isms. And since I began with a personal question, I'll end with a personal question too. So, other than your academic writings about India, how strong is your connection to India now? I mean, do you have family here now? How often do you visit India? And more importantly, are there any particular Indian or Bengali habits, socio-cultural, that you have retained in the States? Or are there any such things that you have left or had to leave for whatsoever reasons?
Okay. Oh, the first is very easy to answer. I'm very strongly attached to India. We come back almost every year. Or at least every 18 months. But there have been occasions when we have been to India 3 times a year. My son is 8. He's been to India 7 times. So
Oh,
you can see, right? So that is there, and uh, the here, Urbana Champaign is an interesting place if you talk about the Bengali experience. because this is where Rothindranath Thakur studied agriculture, right, in our
Okay.
university.
Yes.
And Rabindranath came here 3 times. And this is here he bought a house, which I think was demolished later. There's a different house in that
Hmm.
address. I think it was demolished during the Second World War. Um, but this is the only property he bought outside India, right? And he gave a series of talks here. And so we have the Tagore Utsav every year.
Hmm.
Uh, and pretty vibrant Bengali community. Not that I frequent that a lot, but there is. I mean, that's one of the uh, wonderful things about being part of a international research university, that you just have students from close to 150 or more countries and faculty too.
Hmm.
So you have that cosmopolitan experience, but at the same time, in terms of Bengali habits, food being a very important thing, we have everything. We have rui mach, ilish mach, anything that you can think of
Okay.
can be got.
Posto.
Posto, yes, it's no
Okay.
problem.
Okay. Okay.
We
So
get our
that's great. That's
ilish.
great. That's
Yeah,
yeah.
we get our ilish from
That's
Chicago.
Podda
Podda.
or
It's a Bangladeshi
okay.
shop.
Okay.
Podda, and well, let me rub it in. It's probably the best quality.
Okay.
It's the stuff that gets separated early from the catch as export quality. So
Uh, yeah. So that's nice to hear. So we'll not keep you any longer. Thank you so much. And Megha, would you do the winding up, please?
Yeah, sure. Thank you once again. It was lovely to have you among us, and there was like a lot of things I learned as a student myself today, and I got a chance to increase my perspectives and everything. So this is where we end today. Thank you, Professor Anustup Basu. Thank you, Professor Saurav Banerjee, to have this conversation with us. Thank you so much.
thank you.
Thank you. Thank you,
Thank you very
Anustup. Thank
much.
you very much.
It was a pleasure.